Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
Rick Lansing's presence in Port Charles has always been complicated, but the day he confronted Ava Jerome, his words carried a weight that even she had not anticipated. The courthouse was filled with whispers, reporters scribbling notes, and family members standing by, watching the spectacle unfold. Ava, who had managed to avoid consequences more times than anyone could count, stood in her designer dress with her chin lifted, pretending that none of this would touch her. But Rick knew her act. He saw through the calm facade and the way she narrowed her eyes when he approached her. There was history between them, unspoken truths that hovered like ghosts in the room. Everyone expected Rick to make a cutting remark, perhaps a typical legal jab, but what he delivered was far worse. He leaned close, his voice dropping so only Ava could truly register the venom, and he said 6 words that would haunt her long after the verdict was read. The room itself seemed to still in that instant. Ava's eyes flickered, betraying the tiniest hint of fear, but she quickly masked it with that signature smirk she wore whenever cornered. Rick stepped back, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of triumph there. These were not just any words, they were calculated, chosen to dismantle her from the inside out, to remind her of everything she had fought to keep buried. The silence that followed was deafening, and even though most of those present couldn't hear exactly what he said, they knew something had shifted. Ava's bravado cracked just enough to reveal that this was no ordinary courtroom battle. This was personal, and it was devastating. As the judge called the room back to order, Ava's mind spun. Those 6 words echoed in her head, louder than the gavel, louder than the mutterings of the gallery. She thought she had prepared herself for this day, rehearsed her defiant stance, even planned which headline she would allow to run once the press devoured her downfall. But nothing could have prepared her for Rick Lansing's quiet, cutting assault. He wasn't shouting accusations. He wasn't reminding her of her crimes in front of the jury. No, Rick had done something far worse. He had struck her where she was weakest, and he had done it with precision. Ava's hands clenched into fists, her pulse racing, her carefully crafted mask threatening to crumble as she awaited the judge's final words. Ava had faced prison before. She had faced mob rivals, betrayals, heartbreak, and loss. But there was something about Rick's approach that left her rattled in a way few ever could. He knew her story. He knew her sins, but more importantly, he knew her fears. And in those 6 words, he captured everything she had tried so desperately to outrun. She wanted to lash out, to snap back with her trademark wit, but the timing wasn't right. Everyone's eyes were on her, and Rick knew it. That made the sting even sharper. He had left her powerless in the one arena where she usually thrived. As the bailiff prepared to take her into custody, Ava stole one last look at Rick. He wasn't gloating, not in the obvious way. He wasn't reveling in her misery with a grin. Instead, his expression remained cool, deliberate, and calculated. That unsettled her more than anything else. The car ride to Pentonville was long and suffocating. Ava sat silently in the back of the transport van, her wrists shackled, staring out the tiny window as the city streets blurred past. The sound of the metal chains seemed to echo in time with Rick's words. She mouthed them to herself without even realizing it, and every time she did, a new wave of dread washed over her. She hated that he had gotten inside her head. She hated that she couldn't shake it. This wasn't just about going to prison, it was about being branded in a way she hadn't expected. For someone like Ava, reputation was everything. She could survive prison, she could play the game, but surviving those words was another story. By the time the gates of Pentonville loomed in front of her, Ava's thoughts were a storm. She remembered every time she had stood across from Rick in the past, every insult they had traded, every time she had underestimated him. Now she realized he had been waiting for this moment all along. He had been patient, biding his time until the exact second he could deliver his blow. And he had done it flawlessly. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had manipulated, schemed, and played people like pawns for years, only to be undone by 6 words whispered in her ear at the worst possible time. Inside the prison walls, Ava forced herself to snap back into survival mode. She straightened her shoulders, plastered on her bravado, and told herself she was ready for whatever came next. But deep down, Rick's words were still there, eating away at her confidence, a constant reminder that she wasn't untouchable. She replayed them at night when she couldn't sleep, when the cold reality of her cell pressed in. They became a mantra of torment, a soundtrack to her downfall. And as the days turned into weeks, Ava realized something she had never admitted to herself before. Rick Lansing had finally found a way to break her spirit without ever laying a hand on her. The nights in Pentonville dragged on endlessly, each hour more suffocating than the last. Ava Jerome, who once commanded entire rooms with a glance and wielded her power like a finely sharpened blade, now lay on a thin prison mattress staring at the cracks in the ceiling. Every creak of the metal door, every muffled voice echoing through the cell block, seemed to fold back into her memory of Rick's 6 words. She hated herself for letting them take root, but the truth was undeniable. Rick had crafted them to pierce, not just to wound. He had studied her long enough to know where her deepest vulnerabilities lived, and with surgical precision, he had exposed them. For days, Ava refused to let anyone see the torment she carried. She strutted through the prison yard as though nothing could touch her, her chin raised, her eyes sharp, daring anyone to challenge her. Other inmates watched her with curiosity, some with jealousy, others with caution. She had always been good at wearing masks, and this was no different. But when night fell and the walls closed in, Rick's words whispered back to her in a loop, gnawing away at her pride. She would squeeze her eyes shut, press her palms over her ears, and will them to stop echoing, but the effort was futile. Once spoken, those words could not be undone. It wasn't just what Rick had said, it was the timing. He hadn't screamed them in anger, hadn't thrown them like a weapon in a heated exchange. No, he had leaned in calmly, like a man utterly in control, and dropped them into her ear like poison. That restraint was what unsettled her most. Rick had not needed to raise his voice because he knew the damage was permanent. He wanted her to replay them exactly as he delivered them, soft and deliberate, a dagger hidden inside a whisper. Every time she thought of his expression in that moment, cold, measured, victorious, her stomach twisted. Ava began to wonder if this had been Rick's goal all along, if every time they had crossed paths in Port Charles, every sparring match and every sharp exchange, he had been cataloging her weaknesses. It was the kind of move she would make, study your enemy, wait until the perfect opportunity, and strike so cleanly they never recover. To realize someone had used her own philosophy against her was the cruelest irony of all. She had underestimated Rick Lansing, written him off as another lawyer with a grudge, another man trying to make his mark. But now she understood, he wasn't trying to win just a legal victory. He wanted to brand her soul, to remind her of something she could never escape. In the silence of her cell, Ava found herself replaying not just Rick's words but the fragments of her life that made them sting so deeply. She thought of the people she had lost, the bridges she had burned, the family she had manipulated. Every bad decision lined up in her mind like a parade of ghosts, all converging on the single moment where Rick distilled it into 6 words. It wasn't fair, she told herself. He didn't know the full story. He couldn't possibly understand what had driven her choices, the desperation, the survival instinct that had carried her through impossible situations. Yet the more she tried to justify it, the clearer it became. Rick had cut through her excuses and left only the raw truth behind. When the guards escorted her to the visiting room one afternoon, Ava expected it to be another perfunctory check-in from her attorney or perhaps a rare appearance from someone in her fractured family. But when she walked through the door and saw Rick sitting at the table, calm as ever, her heart skipped a beat. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had already won. He had already broken her down. And yet, there he was, waiting, his gaze steady, his hands folded neatly on the table. She almost turned back, but the guard ushered her forward, and soon she was sitting across from the man who haunted her every thought. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. She wanted to sound in control, to sound unbothered, but the edge of panic betrayed her. Rick didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, as if to remind her that he was still dictating the terms of this encounter. Finally, he leaned forward, just slightly, and that same calm tone washed over her like a cold wave. "You haven't forgotten," he said. "I can see it in your eyes." Ava bristled, her nails digging into the table. She hated that he could read her so easily, hated that he knew his words had left scars. She wanted to spit venom back at him, to remind him that she was Ava Jerome, survivor of wars, manipulator of men, mother who had clawed her way through hell. But nothing came out. Her throat tightened, her mind scrambled, and in that silence, Rick's victory deepened. When the guard announced time was up, Ava nearly bolted from the room, her composure unraveling the moment she was out of Rick's line of sight. Back in her cell, she paced furiously, muttering under her breath, trying to summon the fire that had always kept her going. But the more she tried to shake it, the clearer it became Rick had planted something inside her that she could not uproot. His 6 words weren't just an insult. They were a prophecy, a condemnation, and a sentence that would outlast even her prison term. By the end of her second week in Pentonville, Ava knew one thing for certain: she could survive the inmates, the guards, even the harsh conditions. What she wasn't sure she could survive were the echoes of Rick Lansing's voice, repeating the 6 words that had reduced her empire, her bravado, and her self-image to rubble. For the first time in years, Ava Jerome felt powerless, and that, more than any prison cell, was the punishment she had never seen coming. The quiet of the prison cell had a way of amplifying every memory Ava tried to bury. She would close her eyes and attempt to sleep, but instead, the past surged back, uninvited and merciless. Rick's 6 words had not only cut her in the moment, they had become the trigger that unlocked every dark corridor of her history. She saw Morgan Corinthos's face, young and vibrant, before everything had spiraled into tragedy. She remembered Connie Falconeri's eyes the moment she pulled the trigger, the shock and horror frozen forever. She even felt again the suffocating dread of knowing that Kiki, her daughter, had nearly paid the price for Ava's choices time and time again. Rick had not needed to name names, the words alone forced her to relive every betrayal, every loss, every sin etched into her conscience. She tried telling herself that it was all just noise, that Rick Lansing wasn't important enough to define her. Yet when the darkness closed in and the prison sounds dulled, those 6 words felt like a sentence more binding than the bars around her. It wasn't prison she feared, it was the truth he had planted in her mind. Ava prided herself on her ability to compartmentalize, to push guilt into the corners and keep moving forward. But now those corners had collapsed, and guilt poured out like water through a broken dam. There were moments, brief flashes, when Ava thought about fighting back. She imagined ways to retaliate, to twist Rick's words and throw them back in his face. After all, Ava Jerome had survived mob wars, dangerous affairs, and the constant threat of betrayal. She had always been the one to cut deeper, to manipulate harder, to find the weak spot in others. But here, in Pentonville, stripped of her influence and resources, the playing field was gone. Rick had delivered his blow at the precise moment when she had nothing left to shield herself with. That was what made it unbearable. His words weren't just cruel, they were final. Days bled into nights, and Ava began to notice small changes in herself. Her usual spark, the way she carried herself with defiance, started to dull. Other inmates whispered about it, wondering why Ava Jerome, the infamous survivor, suddenly seemed distracted and restless. She brushed them off with sarcastic remarks, but inside she knew the truth: she was unraveling. The more she replayed Rick's words, the more she felt them seep into her identity. She was no longer the powerful Ava who outwitted enemies and bent situations to her will. She was simply a woman caught in her own regrets, tethered by 6 words that branded her as something she couldn't escape. One evening, during dinner in the mess hall, Ava caught herself staring at the table without touching her food. She could hear voices around her, the clattering of trays, but none of it registered. All she could hear was Rick, whispering those words like a curse. The inmate across from her snapped, "Earth to Jerome, you gonna eat or just stare?" Ava blinked, jolted back, and forced a brittle smile. "Don't worry about me," she muttered. But in that moment, she realized how far gone she was. If Rick could reach her here, in the middle of the noise and chaos, then his victory was complete. She thought of her family, of Avery and Kiki, of the times she had sworn to do better. Those promises felt hollow now. Rick's words had twisted themselves around every vow she had ever made, every fragile step toward redemption she had ever attempted. Even if she were to walk out of Pentonville tomorrow, free and unburdened, those 6 words would follow her like shadows. They had become her mirror, showing her not the glamorous, powerful Ava she presented to the world, but the woman underneath, the one broken by her own history. The sterile, antiseptic air of General Hospital's 5th-floor private ward was a lie. It was a veneer of calm painted over a roiling, festering truth. Inside room 512, the silence was a physical presence, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, artificial beeping of a heart monitor. It was a sound that, for weeks, had been a lifeline, a testament to a fragile, clinging existence. Now, it felt like a countdown. Ava Jerome, her complexion still pale against the stark white of the hospital pillows, looked every bit the recovering victim. The elegant bones of her face were sharper than usual, a testament to the weight she had lost, the ordeal she had endured. But her eyes, those famously expressive dark eyes, held a storm of defiance and a deep, chilling dread. She was a woman trapped, not by the 4-line taped to the back of her hand, but by a web of her own weaving, a web that had been seized and controlled by a master manipulator. And he was here. Mason, his bulk a silent, menacing shadow in the corner of the room, had opened the door for him. And now, Rick Lansing stood at the foot of her bed. He wasn't smiling, not in the traditional sense. His expression was one of somber, almost paternal concern, a mask so perfectly crafted it was more terrifying than any overt threat. He held a single, long-stemmed white rose, a grotesque parody of a get-well gift. He placed it gently on the bedside table, its pristine petals a stark contrast to the ugliness he represented. "Ava," he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur that set her teeth on edge. "You're looking stronger. The doctors are very pleased." She said nothing. Her gaze was fixed on him, a bird trapped by a snake. She knew this visit wasn't about her health. It was about the leash he held, and the moment had come to give it a sharp, painful tug. "The DA's office is moving forward," Rick continued, his hands clasped in front of him, the picture of a respectful, concerned citizen. "The evidence, it's overwhelming. The gun, the forensics from the gallery, your inconsistent statements in the immediate aftermath." Ava's throat tightened. "You know why it's inconsistent," she whispered, the words scraping out. Rick's eyes, cold and calculating, met hers. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent command to watch her words. Mason was listening. The walls, in Rick Lansing's world, were always listening. "I know this is difficult to face," he said, his tone shifting into that of a seasoned lawyer laying out a bleak but unavoidable reality. "Acceptance is the first step toward any kind of resolution. You need to accept the full weight of what happened. The pain you've caused, the pain you're in. You need to articulate it, Ava. To yourself. To the court. To me." He took a step closer, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "I was reviewing your case file last night, thinking of your defense. And it struck me. Your actions, your state of mind, they can only be understood through the lens of pain. Your pain. You need to own it. To give it a name." Ava's heart began to hammer against her ribs, the monitor beside her bed betraying her spike of anxiety with a quickening series of beeps. She knew this was not about building a defense. This was about his dominion over her. This was a ritual of subjugation. "What are you talking about, Rick?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. 6 words, he said, his gaze locking onto hers, holding her captive. 6 words that encapsulate the entirety of your suffering. 6 pain words. Speak them. Acknowledge them. Let them be the foundation we build on. Say them, Ava, and you'll begin to understand the path forward. Refuse. He let the sentence hang, the unspoken threat more potent than any explicit one. The image of her daughter, Kiki, flashed in Ava's mind, vibrant, innocent, and devastatingly vulnerable. Tears of frustration and terror welled in her eyes. This was a fresh form of torture, more psychological and cruel than any physical assault. He wasn't just threatening her body or her freedom, he was demanding the surrender of her very soul, forcing her to codify her own agony for his benefit. Please, she begged, a single, broken syllable. 6 words, Ava, he repeated, his voice relentless, soft as velvet-covered steel. The first one. The most obvious. The one that brought you here. The one you feel in every weakened muscle, with every labored breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block him out, but his presence was inescapable. He was the architect of this nightmare. He was the one who had ensured the evidence pointed to her, who had manipulated the scene, who held the key to her exoneration and would only use it if she proved herself to be his utterly compliant pawn. "Say it," he commanded, the gentle facade slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing the iron will beneath. A shudder ran through her. "Shot," she breathed, the word tasting like ash. "I was shot." The beeping of the monitor escalated. Rick's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "Good. That's one. The physical trauma. But that's just the surface, isn't it? The body heals. It's the mind that holds on to the real injury. The betrayal." The second word, Ava. What did it feel like when you realized you'd been betrayed? When you understood that the person you cared for had turned on you? This was a deeper cut. This was about the man she had loved, the man who had pulled the trigger. Her mind reeled back to that moment in the gallery, the confusion, the searing heat, the crushing realization that the person she had trusted, had shared a bed with, had intended to end her life. Betrayed, she whispered, the word a confession that tore at her insides. It was a word that encompassed not just that moment, but her entire life, a pattern of men who used, abused, and discarded her. Betrayed, Rick echoed, as if tasting the word himself. Yes. A profound, personal betrayal. That's two. Now, the consequence. The isolation. You're lying here, surrounded by people, but you are utterly alone, aren't you? Because of your secrets. Because of the walls you've built. The third word, Ava. The loneliness. A sob caught in her throat. He was right. Her sister, her friends, they were on the other side of a glass wall, a wall constructed of the lies she had told to protect herself, lies that Rick had now weaponized. She was completely and utterly alone in this fight. Alone, she choked out, the admission feeling like a defeat. I am so alone. 3, Rick counted, his voice a soft, approving purr. He was breaking her down, piece by piece, and she was letting him. Now, think beyond this room. Think of your future. The life you had, the freedom, the status, it's all gone. Stripped away. Because of one night. Because of your choices. The fourth word is about loss. The life you've lost. A vision of her art gallery, her home, her clothes, the vibrant social life she curated, it all flashed before her eyes, gray and lifeless. It was all receding, becoming a memory belonging to someone else. Everything, she wept, the tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. I've lost everything. 4, he said, his satisfaction palpable. But you're a fighter, Ava. A survivor. That loss, that betrayal, it breeds something else, doesn't it? A cold, hard stone in the pit of your stomach. The desire for payback. For justice. Or is it vengeance? The fifth word. The rage you're trying so hard to hide from the nurses, from your family. The fury that keeps you warm at night. This was the most dangerous admission. To give voice to the rage was to give him power over it. It was to confirm the narrative of the vengeful, scorned woman that the prosecution would surely paint. But the anger was there, a molten core beneath the fear and self-pity. Anger at the man who shot her, anger at the system that was failing her, and a pure, incandescent anger at the man standing before her, orchestrating it all. Fury, she hissed, her eyes snapping open to glare at him, the word laced with all the venom she felt. Rick's eyes gleamed. He had drawn the serpent's fang and was now holding it up to the light. Fury. Yes. A powerful, motivating force. That's 5. He took the final step, now standing directly beside her bed, looking down at her as a doctor might look at a fascinating, terminal case. And now, the last one, Ava. The most important one. The one that ties all the others together. The pain that comes from knowing that you are trapped. That your fate is no longer in your hands. That you are powerless. He leaned down, his face so close she could smell the faint scent of his cologne, a clean, expensive scent that now smelled of pure corruption. "The sixth word," he whispered, his breath ghosting across her ear. "What is the final, inescapable truth of your situation, right here, right now?" Her body went rigid. This was the crux of it all. This was the word that would seal her fate, that would acknowledge his total control. To say it was to surrender completely. She looked past him, at Mason's impassive face, at the closed door that represented her captivity, at the white rose that was a symbol of his perverse ownership. She thought of Kiki, her brightest light, her most profound vulnerability. Rick held all the cards. He had the evidence to convict her or to set her free. He had the means to harm everyone she loved. She was in a cage of his design, and the key was in his pocket. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, cold acceptance. She was defeated. For now. "Trapped," she said, her voice a hollow, broken thing. The single word hung in the sterile air, a confession of utter defeat. "I am trapped." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the heart monitor, its rhythm slowing into a resigned, steady beat. Rick Lansing straightened up, a look of profound, paternalistic satisfaction smoothing his features. He had what he came for. Shot. Betrayed. Alone. Everything. Fury. Trapped, he recited, the 6 words forming a dark, brutal poem of her existence. Remember those words, Ava. Hold on to them. They are your truth now. They are your pain. And I am the only one who can lead you through it. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked toward the door, Mason falling into step behind him. The door clicked shut, leaving Ava alone with the 6 words echoing in the silence, each one a brick in the prison he was building for her, a prison far more secure than any the state of New York could ever construct. The days that followed were a blur of legal formalities and a deepening sense of unreality. The 6 words Rick had forced from her became a mantra of despair, playing on a loop in her mind. Her arraignment was a spectacle. The Port Charles press, hungry for a scandal involving one of the city's most notorious socialites, swarmed the courthouse. Flashbulbs popped, capturing her pale, drawn face. She stood before the judge, a solitary figure in a simple, dark suit, her hands cuffed in front of her. The charges were read: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and a host of related offenses. The evidence, as Rick had promised, was overwhelming. A gun registered to her, found at the scene. Gunshot residue on her clothing. Testimony about her volatile relationship with the victim, her public threats. It was a perfect, airtight case, and she knew exactly who had engineered its perfection. Her court-appointed lawyer, a well-meaning but overworked public defender, whispered to her about a plea deal. He spoke of mitigating circumstances, of temporary insanity due to emotional distress. He was speaking a language of compromise, of survival. But Ava heard only the echo of Rick's 6 words. A plea deal would mean accepting the narrative, becoming the woman Rick had defined, shot, betrayed, alone, having lost everything, acting out of fury, and now, permanently trapped. She thought of Kiki, whose visits to the hospital had been filled with tears and confusion. She thought of her sister, Julian, trying to mount a defense, unaware that the true enemy was the man pretending to be their ally. To plead guilty was to disappear into the system, to become a number, to surrender any chance of ever clearing her name or reclaiming her life. It was to live the rest of her days defined by those 6 words. But to fight it, to go to trial with Rick Lansing as her architect of doom, was a guaranteed conviction and a much longer sentence. He had made that abundantly clear. He had presented her with a choice between 2 kinds of hell, and he was the devil presiding over both. It was during a private meeting with her lawyer, in a cold, windowless room in the courthouse, that the final piece of Rick's plan snapped into place. Her lawyer was explaining the logistics of the plea bargain when the door opened and Rick Lansing walked in, carrying a leather-bound portfolio, the picture of legal prowess and sober responsibility. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice filling the small room. "But I believe I may be able to help." Ava's blood ran cold. This was the performance. This was the moment he stepped into the light as her savior. I've been consulting with the Jerome family, Rick continued, addressing the public defender. Given the complexities of this case and my history with the family, I've offered my services pro bono. I believe I can secure a much better outcome for Ms. Jerome than a standard plea deal. The public defender, visibly relieved to be off a case that was a guaranteed loss, readily agreed. Within minutes, the paperwork was signed, and he was gone, leaving Ava alone with her puppeteer. The moment the door closed, Rick's demeanor shifted. The compassionate advocate vanished, replaced by the cold strategist. The plea deal they offered is a trap, he said without preamble, tossing the file onto the table. 20 years. You'd be an old woman when you got out. Kiki would be middle-aged. You'd have nothing. Ava stared at him, her hatred a tangible force in the room. And you have a better option? I do, he said, a slow, calculated smile touching his lips. We reject the plea. We go to trial. We present a defense of justifiable force. You were a woman in fear for her life, acting against a known criminal who had threatened you. We muddy the waters. We cast doubt. And the evidence? The gun? The residue? Leave that to me, he said, his voice dropping. I'm a very good lawyer, Ava. But it requires your absolute trust. Your unwavering compliance. You will say what I tell you to say, when I tell you to say it. You will embody the narrative I create for you. The narrative of a victim, not a villain. The woman who spoke those 6 words of pain to me. We will use them. He was offering her a thread of hope, a chance to fight, but she knew it was an illusion. He was not offering her freedom, he was offering her a different role to play in the prison of his design. To accept his defense was to hand him the script of her life.